when a life ends but the questions don't. Hollywood's golden age created many legends, but only a few were transformed into myths so quickly that reality itself seemed to disappear behind the image. Some stars faded, some walked away, and some vanished so abruptly that the industry never had time to explain what had happened, only to package it. And as you listen to this story, it's worth asking a question that still lingers decades later. What happens when a star disappears before the world has finished understanding who they were? James Dean is remembered as an icon of rebellion, youth, and restlessness, a face frozen forever in time, untouched by age or compromise. His image is instantly recognizable, his influence undeniable, and his name synonymous with an entire generation's unease. Yet beneath the mythology lies a disappearance that was not merely physical, but emotional, cultural, and deeply unresolved. Because James Dean did not simply die young, he vanished before Hollywood could decide what to do with him. Rise, fame without control. James Dean arrived in Hollywood at a moment when the industry was beginning to fracture, when old rules no longer fit perfectly and new kinds of masculinity were emerging on screen. Unlike the polished leading men before him, Dean was unpredictable, vulnerable, and visibly uncomfortable with conformity. His performances felt less like acting and more like exposure, and audiences responded with an intensity Hollywood had rarely seen. In a remarkably short time, Dean became the face of youthful alienation, embodying emotions many people felt but could not articulate. Yet this sudden fame came with a dangerous imbalance. His image grew faster than the industry's ability to contain it. Studios struggled to shape him into something marketable without dulling what made him compelling. And Dean himself resisted being molded, often clashing with expectations and authority. What's crucial to understand is that James Dean was not yet secure when he became famous. He was still forming his identity, still questioning his place in the world, and still emotionally raw. And that raises a troubling question. What happens when the world projects meaning onto someone who hasn't yet figured out their own? Pressure becoming the symbol. As Dean's fame exploded, so did the pressure to embody something larger than himself. He was no longer just an actor. He became a symbol of rebellion, masculinity, danger, and emotional honesty. Interviews, photographs, and public appearances froze him into a role he had never consciously chosen, and the more he resisted it, the more compelling the image became. Behind the scenes, Dean was restless and dissatisfied, uncomfortable with the way his identity was being simplified and sold. He struggled with isolation, perfectionism, and a persistent sense of being misunderstood, even as the world celebrated him. And this contradiction is essential to his story. How lonely does someone become when they are adored for a version of themselves that isn't entirely real? Unlike stars who learned to navigate Hollywood's machinery, Dean never settled into it. He remained volatile, introspective, and difficult to categorize, which made him fascinating and dangerous to an industry built on predictability. The faster his fame rose, the less control he seemed to have over his own narrative. The moment a disappearance the world watched. When James Dean died in a car crash at just 24 years old, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Grief spread rapidly, headlines froze his image in time, and the industry rushed to memorialize what it had barely begun to understand. His death was framed as tragedy, cautionary tale, and legend all at once, leaving little room for nuance or unanswered questions. But here's what makes his disappearance different. James Dean did not fade away. He did not choose invisibility. He vanished suddenly, violently, and irrevocably, leaving behind only fragments, 3 films, countless photographs, and a mythology built almost overnight. And it forces us to ask something uncomfortable. Did James Dean disappear, or was he consumed so quickly that nothing real was left behind? Hollywood responded by immortalizing him, which paradoxically erased the complexity of who he actually was. His vulnerability became stylized, his struggles became romanticized, and his absence became profitable. After the crash, when death becomes a beginning. When James Dean died, Hollywood did not pause to grieve in private. It reacted instantly, decisively, and commercially. Within hours, his death was framed not just as a tragedy, but as a moment of transformation, the birth of a legend. Studios, journalists, and audiences all participated in the same act, consciously or not. They froze James Dean in time. The young man who had been restless, uncertain, and still forming an identity was suddenly fixed forever at 24, preserved at the exact moment when potential outweighed reality. And this raises an unsettling question that still echoes today. What happens when someone dies before the world finishes using them? The speed with which meaning was assigned to Dean's death is striking. His life was immediately reshaped into a cautionary tale about youth, rebellion, and danger, even though those themes had never been fully resolved in his work or his personal life. The complexity of who he was, the insecurity, the tenderness, the contradictions, was compressed into an easily recognizable symbol. In death, he became simpler than he had ever been in life. Hollywood's response, controlling the narrative. Hollywood understood instinctively that James Dean's disappearance could not be left undefined. Ambiguity is dangerous in an industry built on control, and so his story was quickly curated. The unfinished parts of his career were polished, the rough edges softened, and his vulnerability was reframed as mystique. Films he had already completed gained new significance, not because they revealed more of him, but because they became the only evidence audiences would ever have. This process was not malicious, but it was efficient. The industry did not ask what James Dean might have wanted his legacy to be. It decided instead what would sell, what would endure, and what would be easiest to remember. And as you reflect on this, it's worth asking, who owns a legacy when the person who lived it is no longer here to defend it? The myth that formed around Dean became self-sustaining. Posters, photographs, and quotes circulated endlessly, often detached from context, reinforcing an image of eternal rebellion and cool detachment. The man himself, anxious, searching, deeply sensitive, slowly disappeared beneath the weight of the symbol. The cost of immortality, being remembered incorrectly. James Dean's immortality came with a price that is rarely acknowledged. Because he died young, he was never allowed to evolve. He was never permitted to disappoint, to fail, to age, or to contradict the image that formed around him. While this preserved his appeal, it also stripped away his humanity. He became an idea rather than a person, admired but not understood. This kind of remembrance is seductive because it feels flattering, but it is also profoundly limiting. Dean's disappearance was not just the loss of a life, but the loss of possibility, the films he never made, the growth he never experienced, the complexity he never had time to express. And it leads to a haunting thought. Is it better to be remembered perfectly or to be remembered honestly? For audiences, the myth offered comfort. For Hollywood, it offered profit. But for the truth of who James Dean was, it offered very little. The long shadow, influence without presence. In the decades following his death, James Dean's influence only grew. Generations of actors cited him as inspiration. Fashion, music, and youth. Culture repeatedly returned to his image as shorthand for authenticity and rebellion. And yet, this influence existed without presence. Dean could not respond to it, challenge it, or reshape it. His disappearance had become permanent, not just physically, but narratively. This raises an unsettling contradiction. James Dean is one of the most recognizable faces in film history, yet one of the least fully known. His life has been studied endlessly, but always through the lens of absence. We analyze what he represented, not who he became, because becoming requires time, something he was never given. And perhaps this is the most disturbing aspect of his story. The world did not just lose James Dean, it lost the chance to be surprised by him. What his disappearance reveals: fame without mercy. James Dean's disappearance exposes a brutal truth about fame. especially during Hollywood's golden age. The industry was prepared to elevate him, but not to protect him. It celebrated his intensity without providing stability, admired his vulnerability without offering support, and ultimately benefited from his absence more than it ever benefited from his presence. Unlike stars who faded slowly or chose to withdraw, Dean vanished abruptly, leaving no room for negotiation or reflection. His story forces us to confront the reality that fame does not pause for human fragility. It moves forward relentlessly, shaping narratives whether the people at the center of them are ready or not. And as you consider this, ask yourself, how many legends exist because someone disappeared before they could complicate the story? Final reflection, the most complete disappearance. James Dean did not disappear because he was forgotten. He disappeared because he was remembered too quickly, too completely, and too narrowly. His death allowed the world to define him without resistance, turning a living, searching individual into a permanent symbol. In the end, James Dean's disappearance was not just the loss of a man, but the loss of a future, a reminder that fame can immortalize an image while erasing a person. Hollywood gave him eternity, but took away the one thing that makes a life truly human, the chance to change. And that may be the most unsettling disappearance of all.